Hi, I'm Kevin Auctioner. Recently, I had an opportunity to moderate a discussion, Beef, It's What's Sustainable. We had a panel of industry experts representing all segments of the beef value chain that shared some important insights and information with us. I hope you enjoy. Well, hello everyone and welcome to the Beef, It's What's Sustainable panel show this afternoon, sponsored by our good friends at Corteva Agrisciences. I'm pleased to have a distinguished panel with me that has lots of both expertise and insight on the topic of sustainability, and would like to introduce those folks for you right now. Of course, Damon Palmer, he serves as business lead for Corteva's range and land management business. Colin Woodall is a familiar face to all of us, serving as the CEO of the National Cattlemen's Beef Association. Dr. Sarah Place, she's the Chief Sustainability Officer for Elanco. And we also have a couple of producers with us, John Butler, who is the CEO of Beef Marketing Group in Kansas, as well as Kevin Yon, who along with his wife Lydia and children run Yon Family Farms in South Carolina. Of course, the Yon family has been recognized as the Environmental Stewardship Award winner and have received a number of accolades for what they've done from a conservation and stewardship practice. I'm Kevin Auctioner, host of Cattleman and Cattleman. Happy to direct traffic in this discussion today. And as I said, we're going to be talking about sustainability. Clearly, sustainability is more than just a buzzword. It's a topic that all stakeholders in the industry are interested in learning more about. And whether you're talking about folks like packers and processors or branded food companies, or even as we talked this morning, investment bankers that want to really understand what our industry is doing in terms of sustainability. We've received a black eye as an industry, let's be honest, due to the report a number of years ago, the United Nations report that has been debunked and yet repeated over and over again. And during this panel discussion, I want to both set the record straight, but also give us some practical, tactical, and tangible things we can do as producers to represent our product and our industry. So as we get started, and this is a topic I'd like each one of you to give me your responses to, but would you agree that we've seen an intensification of the topic of sustainability over the last couple of years? It's really ramped up speed, and I would even argue over the last 6 or 8 months in the changeover in U.S. leadership. What have you seen as this has progressed, Damon, over the last several years?
Yeah, so I've been fortunate to be in the industry here over 20 years now. And as I think back, we didn't talk a lot about sustainability in with regards to broader society, but we talked a lot about farming and ranching stewardship 20 years ago. Sustainability, I think, is front and center within consumers and society today. And there are impacts on the beef industry, and I've seen that ramp up greatly, not just in the last 5 to 6 months, but the last five to 6 years as well.
Colin, you spent many years in Washington, D.C. before becoming CEO of our organization, and how have you seen that progress from a political or policy standpoint?
Well, sustainability is not a fad, it's here to stay, and that's also the case when it comes to the government. When you look at the current administration and Congress, it's all about climate change. So we know that there is a very clear nexus between climate issues and what we do on the land. And so we have a great opportunity here as an industry to be at the table and try to lead this discussion, because we don't want to sit back and be regulated. We want to show quite clearly the great work that's already being done and our commitment to continual improvement.
And Dr. Place, certainly you've been on a lot of news media over the last year talking about this issue, but from a corporate perspective, there are a lot of corporations setting targets, and that is being amplified in terms of the topic of sustainability for corporate America.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Kevin. And as you mentioned, right, within investment bankers and others, right, there's this other word out there, or acronym ESG, right, environment, social governance, and that really captures a lot of this discussion as it relates to sustainability as well. So whether it's banks looking at their portfolios or companies looking at what we call Scope 3 emissions, which is the emissions that can come from cattle production, for example, this is something that's been elevated even more.
John, your group spends every day feeding cattle and harvesting cattle, but you have a lot of interaction with food companies, restaurants, food distribution firms. What's your read?
Well, I guess I've gone in the last few years from hardly being able to say sustainability to actually embracing its meaning and so on. And I feel like that, and we've talked at this conference, a lot of the elements of, as we define sustainability, we're engaged in as producers. And whether it be conservation of the resources we have the opportunity to work with, the animals we get to take care of, the economics associated with our business models, we're involved in all of that. And this is just sort of highlighting our opportunity to perhaps quantify it to demonstrate how solid our business is and what it looks like moving into the future.
And Kevin, you spent a lot of time with cow-calf producers in your Angus seed stock operation. I'm curious, what are you hearing? Are you hearing that topic being intensified or being louder over the last several years? What's your read?
I think I have, and to be honest with you, Kevin, as a producer, it was one that maybe I didn't like to hear to start with. I wanted to just ignore it. I thought it was a fad and thought it would just go away, but I think it's very apparent that it's not going to go away, and it shouldn't go away. Maybe we didn't like the word choice, but as a producer, we are stewards. And as we look through our industry has been very traditional and want to take care of the land and want to take care of the cattle and making it better than we found it. But I have engaged in a new understanding, and as many producers have, we know we've got to embrace it and we've got to be proactive, and we've got a good story to tell.
So I want to ask a question to you all as producers. I mean, would you agree that beef production has been targeted as one of the bad guys in this whole sustainability discussion? Why is that? Kevin?
Yeah, well, I think there's a big misunderstanding around beef production. I believe we have an opportunity, and this whole sustainability conversation points out what an opportunity we've got to send the message or address the message about taking a non-consumable product, grass, and turning it into a very, very nutrient-dense, highly palatable protein. We haven't really done that in the past. We've talked about nutrition, we've talked about taste, but tying the point that these animals are able to take a product that is not usable in any other fashion because they have a wonderful system, they've got a ruminant system that they can take that forage, those grasses, and turn it into protein, is perhaps one of the key messages that comes out for me as I look at this in the time we're in today.
Let me pitch it to Dr. Place for a minute, because you have talked about this great upcycler that we have in a cow. Tell me how we can combat some of this misinformation that has been spewed so broadly by media.
Yeah, so I think the key thing is, as John just mentioned, right, it is about making sure that we tell that story and tell it in a way that connects with consumers. And it may not be the same message to each one of those audiences that we deliver, but I think it is important for us to always beat home that key message that at the end of the day, people want to eat beef, right? It is delicious, it is nutritious, and as John said, right, we have that story that we can tell in different ways of the amazing power of the ruminant animal, right? And I think we shouldn't lose sight of that essentially this industry is a solar-powered industry, right? We use rainwater, we use sunlight, we're able to convert those resources into such a high-quality, nutritious product, right? And there are these other challenges we deal with and opportunities for us to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and other things. But I think we should always focus on that core home base that people love to eat beef and they want to have permission to keep enjoying that beef in the future, right? And I think the beef industry has an excellent story to tell from that standpoint.
Colin, you have enormous experience talking to people who may not see things quite like we do. So as you begin combating that misinformation without being combative and defensive, what would you recommend?
Well, it's not only just trying to combat the misinformation from outside groups, but to be honest with you, Kevin, it's about convincing producers that this is where we need to be. When we talk about sustainability, you usually get one of three reactions. Those who put their arms up and said, here we go again. those whose eyes just kind of glaze over and go to their phone, and those that go, yeah, this is where we need to be. And what we're trying to do is get all of our community to understand that we have to be at the table because of these detractors, because of the misinformation. And if, as an industry, we are fragmented in our response, we are not going to mount an effective campaign to get out there and combat that misinformation and truly show the leadership that's been identified by all of our panelists thus far and what we can do as an industry.
Damon, a lot of us spend a lot of our days with cattle producers. You, on the other hand, have a professional job in the agri-science industry that I suspect some days are spent with cattle producers and farmers, and other days are spent with folks that may be in Indianapolis and other places, correct?
That's correct.
I'm curious to know, what would you recommend in terms of how we combat this misinformation?
Yeah, I think one of the challenges with the misinformation is just the society we live in today. We have to speak in sound bites. It has to be easy to digest. We're talking about a really neat animal that has a rumen and can really do some great things from an upcycling perspective, but we've got to get it into sound bites that consumers can understand, and also audiences beyond just consumers. So I think that's a challenge we've got to get that message broadly understood.
Kevin, has ranchers always been sustainable?
You know we have, and as the industry, the proof is in the pudding, and as the country music song says, we were sustainable when sustainability wasn't cool.
That's right.
But it's
Will you sing that for us?
not today. But it's a term that maybe we didn't relate to right off. But that's what's made our industry what it is today, is people that cared about their families, cared about their communities, cared about the environment, and did what they did because they wanted something to pass down to their families. So yes, we have been, but we just can't come to meetings like this and talk about it among ourselves. We've got a wonderful story to tell. We get to work with an amazing creature, a cow that's a ruminant. There's no other animal that produces such high quality food as the cow. And she can take feedstuffs that are not usable to other protein sources and turn them into a wonderful product. So we have that story to tell, and as a producer, whether we enjoy it or not, and whether we're very articulate with it or not, we should be willing to tell that story and not depend on just others to tell our story for us.
So John, let me pick up where Colin left off. What do you say to fellow producers who are either tired of hearing the discussion about sustainability or think sustainability is yet another four-letter word?
Yeah, so perhaps a bit controversy. I feel that we've heard here already how important it is for us to tell the story, but I believe we've got to go to the next level, the next step, because yes, we are producers and we have a credible reputation amongst the consumer marketplace, but we're going to have to back up this story with numbers, with metrics, with our ability to demonstrate continual improvement, which is a part of sustainability, but we can't do that just telling the story. No criticism about that, but now I think the expectation is that we go to the next level, and the next level includes producers willing to be transparent about what they're doing, willing to verify what they're doing, so that we can say, hey, not only are we good stewards of all these resources and the animals and focused on economics, but we're getting better. Because many that are in this conversation of sustainability can't do that. And so I think that that's sort of a challenge for all of us. I don't know if others agree, but I'd like to see our industry go to that next step and really start benchmarking and moving in a direction that is improved.
Well, that's really a nice segue to one of my next questions. Colin, I was in the session this morning when you all outlined some very specific goals, and I'd like you to share a little bit about that and what you perceive as the next steps once you've framed a set of specific goals.
Well, we're thrilled to actually be to the point where we can bring goals to the forefront of this industry and to show quite clearly that we do want to be leaders within this discussion. And we're willing to put out public-facing goals. These aren't just goals we're sharing amongst ourselves. These are public-facing goals. We're going to share with the consumer. We're going to share with the government. We're going to share with international bodies in order to illustrate that we're not afraid of this discussion. We're going to get out there. And of course, the focus is to be climate neutral by 2040. We know we can do it. along the lines of what John was talking about. We need to have more metrics. There's going to be more research. We're a better industry now than we were 5-10 years ago, and another 5 to 10 years ago, we're going to be even better. So 2040, we believe, is realistic to be quite clearly in that climate neutral position. But as we know, it's not just about climate. We also have to make sure that we are addressing that social responsibility of sustainability, which is taking care of our animals, taking care of our workers, and then also the economic sustainability, not only for us as producers, but for our communities, because if we're not healthy, if we're not doing the right thing, if we are not at the table, then we're going to lose the opportunity to do all the great work that we're doing as cattle producers.
And the word that I hung on this morning from Marty's presentation was demonstrate. What does that word mean?
Demonstrate it's quite clearly, back to also what John said, it's good to talk about what you're going to do. Now really the hard part is ahead of us, because we put all this effort into saying this is what we're going to do. Now we have to show very clear metrics and demonstrate that we are moving forward. So more of that to come, but this is not just a battle of rhetoric. We have to show real, true, measurable, and continual improvement as an industry.
So Damon, of course, the Corteva team has been sponsoring, and Dow AgroSciences before that, the Environmental Stewardship Award Program. You get on a lot of ranches and farms across the country. I'm curious, what are some of the stewardship and sustainability practices that you see people implementing?
Yeah, so every operation is different. I mean, from East Texas to West Texas, and then the broader geography, East Coast to West Coast, no ranch is the same. But some of the big themes that we see around sustainability and stewardship are rotational grazing. We continue to see grazing management plans, rotational grazing increasing. There's a lot of people out there that are refocusing on the control of invasive species. Invasive species, if not controlled, can really create a monoculture, have detrimental effects to water as well as the land. And then there's a resurgence of wildlife focus. So how do cattle and wildlife coexist? And usually what's good for wildlife is good for a cow. And so those are three areas that we've seen really starting to increase over the last several years.
And producers are doing amazing things as you see the winners of those environmental stewardship awards and what they're doing to invest in the future of leaving things better than they found them. Yeah. Sarah, I hate to do this to you, but you spent a lot of time talking about flatulating cows to respond to the media reports that were being. What do you see being done from an innovative perspective as it relates to carbon and greenhouse gas emissions?
Yeah. So always have to say, hey, it's cow burps, not cow farts, right? But I think that we're seeing a lot of research and interest in that topic area, right? So a lot of the things that have been already mentioned are things that are going to help, right? When we think about better animal performance, right, better animal health, those things can have an impact on the methane emissions from the entire herd, because when animals are going to be more efficient, right, we're going to use fewer feed resources, we're going to have fewer open cows on the landscape. All those things add up to reducing methane emissions, right, from a larger perspective. At the same time, whether it's companies like Corteva, companies like Elanco, there are folks working on solutions that will hopefully also lower methane emissions from the animal as well, right? And that's going to be really key to meet these goals of climate neutrality and others, right? So it really is putting those things together that have been mentioned. We need good ways to measure. We need good measuring sticks, if you will. And then we need the tools that can help producers reduce those emissions further. And in some of those cases, those tools are going to have win-wins, right? There may be things that also make you more profitable, right, and reduce emissions. But those areas where they don't necessarily have a direct benefit, that's where that measurement really comes into play, right? And I'm sure that you all talked about that this morning at the announcement of the goals, but we need those alternative ways to monetize some of this as well, because it comes back to what Colin said, that economic sustainability, economic viability has to be core to this entire discussion, right? If a producer is not economically viable, it doesn't really matter what your methane emissions are, right, or anything else, right? You have to be able to stay in business if we're going to talk about this industry from a long-term perspective. So all those things go together, right? The technical solutions, the measurement, and making it an economically viable solution.
Damon, I was struck the other night by the number of people who talked about, the number of ESAP winners that talked about soil health as an example. And What do you say to people who suggest, we shouldn't be grazing these cows that are emitting greenhouse gas? We should just be using that land for cropland and feeding people directly with those crops that we grow on. What's your response?
Well, I think John and Sarah have covered the upcycling very well. But to think about that from a land use perspective, around 30% of the land in the U.S. is not fit for crops. It's either too hot, too wet, too dry, too rocky, too sandy, and that is where this magnificent animal, the cow, comes in, and they can take the vegetation that's growing in those areas and upcycle that into this nutritious protein that we all love. So a lot of that ground's just not fit for crops.
John and Kevin, I want to ask you to look into your crystal ball just a moment. And, as I talk to producers, one of the questions they ask me is, am I going to get paid for it? And so I'm curious from both your perspective, do you think there will come a time when prices of cattle and or beef will reflect the sustainability practices that can or can't be documented? John?
Well, maybe a way to look at that, a different way to look at it than the specific question is, what will the cost be if we don't? I think that there is an expectation at the consumer level, and many of these publicly traded companies that provide our product to the consumer, large retail companies and food service, that have this expectation. And so there's that way to look at it. I never want to look at the glass half empty, but I think another way to look at it would be what happens when we absolutely implement everything we can in this sustainability conversation. What happens is we become more efficient. We become more profitable. So perhaps we all want premiums. We all wish that is there, but if we wait on that, we may have a disappointment right around the corner. I think that there's a lot of ways, if we collaborate and work together, that if we are bringing a product to the table that scores better on the ESG calculation, for example, that Sarah mentioned, that's important to these companies, it's important to their stakeholders. And when you have those kinds of economic incentives, there's opportunities for that to be shared with the entire supply chain. So I'm optimistic about that, but we got to work at it. We got to work at it together so that economics flow through the entire supply chain.
Kevin, you've added value with your genetics for a long time. Is this another way to add value or collect a price premium, or will it result in a discount at some point? What's your thought?
As a producer, I like the thoughts of opportunity of maybe supplementing our income with something that we already do. We raise forages, and in the Southeast, we try to have something grazable, something growing for our cattle every day of the year. We plant trees. We have lots of trees. So, we got to recognize that maybe as an industry, we've been part of the problem, but yet we can be such a bigger part of the solution with what we already do. Can we do it better? Absolutely. Is there new ways? Can we measure it? And we've got to. But I like the opportunity of thinking there's ways that our incomes can be supplemented as we bring the next generation back to farms and ranches. There's going to be times that cattle might not always pay the bills. So I like the thoughts of getting paid for what we do right, and but not dependent upon that as any kind of stream of income that's going to make our living. It's still going to be the cow.
Colin, a number of these negative sustainability claims, I feel, have been brought by companies who are trying to differentiate their products. Let's call a spade, fake meat, alternative meat companies who said, don't eat beef, our product is more sustainable. Do you think that is truly driving some of the negative publicity around the beef industry, and what could or should we be doing about it?
Oh, I definitely believe that what we're hearing from, let's just say it, Impossible and Beyond and others, is definitely perpetuating that misinformation. There's no doubt about it. But I think we have to be realistic about just how effective that message has been. And we just look back at the pandemic. At the beginning of the pandemic, we saw beef cases cleaned out across this country. And we received photographs from a lot of people where right next to that empty beef case was a full case of Beyond Beef. So while there's no doubt that the consumer is with us, there's also no doubt that they're still asking questions. So we can't take that for granted that they're going to stick with us. We have to continue to push forward. But I got to be honest with you, I think probably our biggest focus needs to be on the government level, because you're hearing a lot of that through the president's discussions, through what's going on in the United Nations, through what's going on in Congress. And if we can really focus on those policymakers and get them to understand the true nature of what we're doing, understand the facts, then I think that will go a long way in helping us kind of ratchet down some of that misinformation. So that's a big part of what NCBA is focused on.
John, I would ask you a similar question, is that it doesn't feel like, even given the tax, it doesn't feel like beef demand is waning. In fact, we heard that it is at a 30-year high. So is sustainability really important? Do consumers really care about it? Or what's driving the continuation of beef demand, even while we have all these naysayers suggesting that it's not the most sustainable food choice you could make?
You know, if you dissect demand a bit, there's a number of drivers. One that we probably don't give enough credit to is export. We've got the very best product in the world, and there are other countries that want it. And actually that's going to pull product and make it more competitive and increase the demand for in domestically as well. So, you know, I think that there's that. We've gone through this horrible COVID situation where there has been sort of a restriction on our ability to deliver 100% against that demand, which is sort of built on itself. So you know, we have been very much the benefactor of being able to enjoy that increased demand, even though it's maybe not as balanced as we'd like it to be throughout the supply chain. The consumer continues to like the product, expressed by her willingness to go, or his willingness to go and pay for it through their pocketbook. So it's an exciting time, and to me, I think even though that demand is there, Kevin, I feel like sustainability is very much an expectation, not to be overlooked at because the demand is there. I think that's going to become an expectation even more so than it is today.
So your guidance is we better not be asleep at the wheel.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yep.
Dr. Place, you are the Chief Sustainability Officer of a large corporation that happens to make a lot of money in the agricultural space, and you are both eloquent and informed in terms of what you share with consumers. We appreciate all you do. My question: why is it important for beef producers themselves, who may not have all the facts that you have and may not be as privy to all the research that you are, to share their story about both sustainability and just production practices in general?
Yeah, I think that's great, and it kind of ties together everything that was said. Of essentially, there are questions out there from consumers, even though, again, we know beef demand is strong, and especially from younger people, right? That ultimately, I think that's the other backdrop of all this is climate change is a big issue, and people are hearing about it, and so they're asking questions, and young people want to make a difference, right? So I think that's a key thing of where some of those questions come from. So from a producer perspective, though, it doesn't have to be some sort of fancy statistics or some scientific study. It honestly is just the nuts and bolts of, hey, what are you doing, right? And just sharing that value of, you know, we really care about our water, for example, in this region, and this is what we're doing for that resource, right? Because we depend on it too. And I think that's the key thing, is to remember that we all are sharing the same environment. We're also all consumers at the end of the day, right? And just having those anecdotal kind of conversations, it doesn't have to be complicated, right? It's just the nuts and bolts of what you're doing on the farm every day. And especially to folks that aren't in agriculture, sometimes the things we think are somewhat mundane on the farm or ranch are actually very intriguing to people in terms of the management practices that take place, or the technology we may use, right?
Colin, NCBA, as one of the contractors of the Beef Checkoff, obviously engages a lot of consumer research. What do consumers want to know about beef industry sustainability?
You know, they really want to know about animal welfare. When we've gone out and talked about sustainability, it's amazing how they take it back to the welfare of the animal. And that's why you saw one of our goals was built around that social responsibility and being able to illustrate quite clearly that the welfare of that animal is by far our number one priority. Our members are out there taking care of those cattle before they're taking care of themselves. So being able to share that with the consumer, I think, is going to go a long way in just showing that overall commitment. Because if we show that we're committed to that animal, it's natural to show that we're also committed to that soil, that grass, that water, that air. It all is a system that works together to keep us whole.
Damon, in your role, you spend a lot of time sitting on airplanes, traveling around the country, taking customers out to dinner. I mean, as you think about the breadth of people you engage with in your corporate job, what do they want to know?
Yeah, so it's a complex conversation to have, as I said before. But just a quick personal story. Last weekend I had the Weather Channel on, and it was a whole special on water. And they threw up a fact that 600 gallons of water are needed for one hamburger patty. So I'm skeptical by nature, and I went to the beef checkoff and said, what's the real number here? And so they had overestimated that by about a 5x factor. And so I think boiling that down, those facts into tangible bits is important. And as I was researching where Weather Channel had gotten their information, it was a website, and it was for teachers. And so I think we've got to start early. So before I get next to somebody on the airplane, we've got to start this messaging very, very early in our urban and suburban schools.
That's a great point. So he said boil it down. As producers, John, first you, and second Kevin, what would you say, what do you want consumers to know about ranching and beef production? John?
Well, I guess I'm going to take the chance to comment on two things. One, to your question about what we want consumers to know, is that we care. We are a people business, that we're passionate about the animals. We are passionate about the dirt. It sounds crazy, but we are. And what's in that soil, and regenerative nature of that soil, and our contribution to that, what we can do. I think there is a very emotional connection to the rancher from a consumer standpoint, and as we take these goals and objectives that Colin talked about earlier, and there's another organization, the United States Roundtable for Sustainable Beef, has a set of goals and objectives. We can't just, as producers, we can't just be satisfied that has been developed. I like to use the term, it's a 3-ring binder, with guidelines and guidance. We have to execute. So we have to take that good work that the trade association has put together, and as producers say, okay, there's the guidelines, this is how I can play in that, this is how I can reflect my commitment and show and demonstrate my improvement and responsibility to resource utilization. So it's twofold.
It doesn't all have to be done at once, right? It is a process of continuous improvement. So it's about each one of us looking at our operations and saying, I could do a better job from a grazing management standpoint, or we could do a better job from an animal handling standpoint. I mean, so it really is a process of continuing improvement. Would you agree? Kevin, what would you add to John's comment?
I think maybe a missing piece of this whole discussion is Damon mentioned the youth, and I think he was mentioning it in context of our non-farm youth. But as an industry, look what we do for our youth. Look how generous agriculture is to the youth, and more specifically beef cattle. If you've been to a FFA convention or a 4-H Congress or a Junior Breed Association show or the beef ambassador, our industry has been very generous to our youth, and those same young people get that passion. What other industry, protein or non-protein or ag or non-ag, that is so generous to their youth and instill that passion that they want to do what they do? That my children and grandchildren want to come back to the family farm and produce food. What's more sustainable for society than that passion?
So I want to follow up on that, because Colin said it earlier, sustainability can quickly focus solely on environmental sustainability, right, Dr. Place? And Colin, you mentioned it. It's about environmental, it's about economic, and it's about social. I wanted to say societal. Let's talk about the people element of this, because the reality is we can do all the environmental things. If we don't have people who are taking care of the cattle, if we don't have people who are willing to show up in the morning at a processing facility, we don't have a sustainable industry. And so you have a next generation who's coming back to yon family farms. What do you want consumers and society to know about what it takes, not just from an environmental standpoint, the improvements we need to make this industry an attractive industry to attract human capital and make it sustainable?
Absolutely. If our industry is going to be sustainable, number one, it's got to be profitable. There's got to be a profit on the farms and ranches that will attract our sons and daughters and grandchildren back to the farm for them to make a living. You know, we just can't say there's not room for you or there's not enough income to go around. But, you know, lots of times on our given operations, family are the employees, but there are also other employees. And I think it's very important to be sustainable that we take care of our people, whether that's physically, mentally, emotionally. I think something else that our industry has done very good at, and none of us like to be boastful, but look at small towns across America, communities across America, and many times look who the backbone of those communities are. Who are the ones that are volunteering for the 4-H club or coaching Little League or the volunteer firemen or in the churches or civic organization? It's our producers. And if you want to get the support of your town or your community, help their community, and it pays big dividends.
Colin, how do we broaden the conversation so that it's not just, it really is a three-legged stool, it's not just about environmental sustainability?
That is a challenge, and we haven't found that silver bullet yet, but it is probably doing more with a lot of our partners up the chain, down the chain, and being able to take advantage of folks like McDonald's, Darden restaurants, to be able to help tell that story. That's where we're going to probably make the most connection with the consumers. And from what we understand in our conversations, it's a story that they are willing to share. But Damon keyed on it. It has to be very small, digestible nuggets, because if we give them a 45-minute show or epistle, we've lost them. It needs to be quick, and that's what we're working to really boil down. How can we develop those quick nuggets that people can eat their Big Mac, see, I feel good about eating this Big Mac, and move on.
Well, I want to say thank you on behalf of all beef producers for coming, for being vulnerable yourself, for being honest and transparent about this topic, and for sharing some of your insight and wisdom with us. We've greatly appreciated it. And of course, to our partners at Corteva, thank you so much for investing in the continuing education around this very important topic of our industry. Now, if you guys would like more information, you can find it at rangeandpasture.com/sustainability, and you will find this entire discussion as well as some additional resources on this topic. Thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you again to the panel.